I'm Glaucia Lemos, and I'm an advocate. Any doubts about this speech or demo, you can go with me at Twitter. Let's understand what is Prisma.
Prisma is a URM of an open code that allows you to manage and easily interact with your database. So much so that the Prisma adopts a different compared to the traditional URMs in the sense that it uses a language to devise a schema, and that's customized, and it generates safety code and to avoid any problems with the code to automatically migrate. And perhaps you ask yourself, why do we use Prisma? For the following reason. There are several advantages that allow us to use the Prisma. One of them is that you have the an app that communicates with the database, and this is the main use for Prisma, even for the server used in JPI that expose data operation technologies with gRPC, and Prisma is an excellent option for all these types of deployment and app. Another advantage of using Prisma is that it worries about the productivity and experience of the developer, in the sense that the productivity and the experience of the developer becomes fundamental for the way we are building our tools. So if we use or looking for trying to have friendly abstractions to develop more complex tasks, this ends up being a problem that may arise in a project. Another advantage that we have of Prisma is the teamwork, because Prisma shines or stands out, especially when it's used in a collaborative environment. The declarative scheme of Prisma provides an overall of the current situation of the database that's easily understood by everyone, be it a younger person who is joined the project or a senior person. This is another advantage of Prisma. You want a tool that holistic can cover the flow of your database. So Prisma is more than OM. You build, a tool for the database that can be used for all workflow for all of those who need to develop their application and can develop more easily with a database. Another point is that the security in typing, since Prisma is a single ORM, that it's totally safe for the TypeScript ecosystem. The client system of Prisma ensures direct, therefore, consumptions in partial place. This typing prevents any future problems when you have to handle and migrate from a relational bank. And finally, you want, a transparent development process. So the development of the open code of Prisma takes place in an open way. Any person who is attending the stall can collaborate towards improving the project, because it's an open source tool. And what are the main concepts of Prisma? We have three concepts. The first one is Prisma Client, and the automatically generated database and safely that allow us to access the database without having to write the query in the language of the database. Another one that's very common is the Prisma Migrate, which is the declarative modeling and customized approach. It uses a data modeling for us to write the database schema. Another one is the Prisma Studio, the modern language to view and digitalize data. It's a simpler way of viewing the data in the database and handling them. Now, concerning the most theoretical part. We are going to talk about the Azure SQL. What does that mean? The Azure SQL is a relational database that's known as DBAS, and it falls within in the sector of platform as a service. And what's good about Azure SQL? You pay only what you use with more expansion without interruption. The database of Azure SQL offer the following options. The single database, which are data with your set of resources managed by a logic cycle. It's the only database that's similar to an independent database. And this option is optimized for more modern applications of new apps. And within the single database, there are two other options integrated with database, with PreScale and serverless. And lastly, we have the Elastic Pool, which is a collection of database with resources shared through the SQL logic. What's interesting about this type of database is that they can be moved inside and outside from an elastic pool. So this helps in optimizing the development of modern applications. In case you want to use the standard of an application and size multi-tenant. But why do we have to use the Azure SQL? Well, because it's totally managed. So the Azure SQL, if you want to automate updates, provision, and backups for you to concentrate in the development of apps, it's another important point that Microsoft handles all the update of the operational system in SQL. So you don't need to manage this underlying infrastructure. And it's also more flexible and responsive. You can use hyperscale computing and a serverless architecture that is quickly adapted to the needs of the developer or the project, and also the protection layer, which are the internal layers and detectors that keep your data safe, the high availability. That is, we use an internal artificial intelligence and highly availability to maintain a peak availability around 99, 95%. And also you can use the last version of the Azure SQL. It's always based on the stable version. And then you are enabled to use the most advanced resources without needing to locally update everything in the cloud. And we cannot forget the advanced data security. You can limit the encrypted threats and the protection in several layers and protecting your data with your data. Now let's talk about the support that Azure SQL has for Prisma. Today, we can say that this is the perfect match or combination. Why? Because the developers that work with relational database end up facing a continuous challenge, or how to guarantee that the code is aligned with the database. So this is very challenging. So the Prisma team discovered that within the system of the Node.js that's popular to create app based on database does not offer modern tools for the developers to deal with this task. Then this conducted an analysis. Although that there are several ORM, so the developers face the challenge in implementing the alterations in the database, and specifically without tools to see statically the changes in codes, database, and so on. So based on this entire study and all the roadblocks that the developers, especially those who work with TypeScript in 2021, the Prisma team, and together with the Azure SQL, they made available this possibility of using it. We are talking about two tools, the very powerful RM, which is Prisma, and one of the huge relational database, a SQL Server, adapting to the cloud. Now we are going to have a demo how we can use a full stack app using the Azure SQL and Prisma. In this demo, in the front end, I'm not going to focus so much on the front end. The focus here is the back end. In the front end, I create a very simple user JS so that we could elaborate the front end, but I'm going to use the back end, the Azure SQL, NodeJs, and function to see how simple it is to create a robust backend app in a few minutes before we truly begin to program something. We need to create the database server, the database, and the shared database. Let's create the database server. We go in the Azure. You can be typing Azure SQL and you click and create, and you have three options. The folks SQL database. We have the types of features we have available, the SQL and the database server. Let's choose first the database server, and there are several information we need to include. For example, the resources or features, server name has to be a single name. I'm going to put JA's database server. And location, you can choose one of the 40 servers made available by Microsoft. I use this too. And here, authentication, let's use SQL authentication. And here we have to include a unique code. In password, we have to include a single password, and I'm going to select a peculiar password. Next step, we need to define the connection network. Let's put network, the firewall rules. We have to allow the Azure to access the server. Yes, and then we can review and create again, and it's going to validate the information. When it's complete, we say go to resources, and then we have a dashboard, but we need to make some changes concerning the firewall. We have to go security firewall, and we leave it on default Azure to access the server, yes, and client ID, save, and then OK. So now that we have the local firewall, we have to create a database. Then we go back to overview, create database, and follow the same standard. We have the database server with the SQL database, and here we can configure the size of this database. Usually for demo purpose, I'm going to put a very small, and service tier, we can use the basic version. And I'm going to put, as it is a demo, the smallest size. We have the message, go to resources, and that's it. Our shared database has been created. If we click on resources, you're going to see that our resources group has 3 days: database server, database linked to the server, and share database. We say city.js, we go settings and SQL database. In this server, we have here the city.js, SP as the SQL database, and share database. And now we can move on with the code. Let's go. Well, so that's the time for us to code. As I explained to you, we are not going to focus on the front end. We are going to focus on the back end. To see the app front end, you go here, npm and port 8080. Then we have a browser, and then where to add a new employee, and we have not integrated with the backend. Let's open our view and let's focus on two folders, client and API, where we are going to create the sources linked to Azure SQL Prisma. We created in our folder. And in this demo, I'm going to use the create and post in order to create a new employee and list all employees. I created my file. Then we are going to install some dependencies. One is Azure Functions and Prisma. Let's do that now. And then let's install the Prisma package. Enter. After it is installed, let's install the client. That's the one that's going to make the communication with the database and the code. Let's install the Prisma package. Enter. So it has been installed. Now you need to have the Code.js, NPM, and Azure Core tools. We are using the version 14 and 4x of the Azure functions. Let's go to the code and let's create a folder called shared. Here I'm going to create two files, arrow.js and prisma.js. In the shared, we are going to have two files, error and prisma.js. But to buy some time, I'm going to quickly show you the code. In the arrow.js, we are creating a function to create a message concerning any error message. Prisma.js, I'm referencing the package of Prisma client. So each time we create a new source, we're going to apply some concepts. And now there is a step where we need to initialize Prisma in our project. We need a specific command in the error folder. We are going to type, let's type the following command, npx dash data or SQL Server. See what happens. It's going to create a schema.prisma with the conditions of the SQL Server and a file called .n to include our URL, the database, and shared database. Now, note that in the code, we have a folder called Prisma, and inside it, we have the schema.prisma, where we can see the provider, which is the client, Prisma, and the data source provider, which is the SQL Server. We are going to put our database URL. Before that, we need to create our connections in this file .n. I'm including my database URL and share database URL. If you have any doubt on how to organize this file in the repository, I created with a template where you can see all the information you need to include in this file. And this is very important to make a communication between what I have here and the connection with the two databases in Azure. After defining it, let's go back to the schema.prisma And let's define our table in a very simple way that Prisma allows us to do. I'm going to create a model employee. It's totally typified. Employee, we have all the registration, everything is typified. And now it's the moment to create this database. In order to do that, we are going to create the command migrate from Prisma and run the following command. Right after, it's going to ask you to create the name of this migration. As I had created, I'm going to put second, and it's going to generate a schema. And here in Prisma, it's going to create a migration for us. And let's code it. Let's create our new function.
Para isso, vamos digitar aqui o comando func init, escolher a opção Node, JavaScript, criou aqui para a gente alguns arquivos. A pastinha VS Code.
This file, this folder, let's send to the outside the project. When we do this, you have this window. You click on yes, and you select JavaScript, and other files will appear in this folder that are very important for the deployment of this application. Now create our first function, which is create employee. We will HTTP trigger, create employee, and okay. In the API folder, we had another folder called employee entity and index.json. Let's define now the routes and types. It will be a post and the route employee, and the index will have a standard. We'll delete and replace for a code that allow us to create a new employee. So here we are calling Prisma and the error file that we created. And here we are calling our model, which is employee, and the word create. Very direct, straightforward. You are creating something. Let's use a create and data for the standard and the fields related to my employee model: name, job, role, salary, employee registration, and we have returns and error treatment in case we have any problems with the connection with the database. Now, let's create the list employees. We go to our command line, func new, HTTP trigger, give a name to this function, return to the press code, change the rounds and the inherent logic to list employees. Now we have two folders, get employee with the same files. Let's alterate them. I have get hold as employee. In get employees, we have again calling the Prisma library and the error file, and we have the error treatment, but we are calling the employee model endpoint, meaning that allows us to find several and order by. I included here. You can define our ascending or descending order. You can select. Now the next step is to communicate between the front and back end. We need this local.set.json and define the host and the course. So we are defining the port and the course. Now we need to communicate the back end with the front end. We need to go to the client of Vue.js, source, services, and API. Here, to facilitate your life, I select three types of URL. One to use locally and another that I created, because if you have a deployment using Conceitos, you can use this slash API. I will comment this in this comment, line 16, because I want to execute the comment. I'm not going to exploit how the deployment will function. So we have the edge point 771/API. Now we need to test the application. First, execute the front and then the back end. And we also need to execute edge functions. I define the script as npm run dev. Enter, you have the two functions here. Now let's test in our application in the browser. The browser is open. I will register my mother, and she is retired with a 2,000 reais salary, and her register 98, and I click employee. We say it listed here, but in the Azure, did it compute this data? Let's see. We open the Azure portal and we go to Azure Database Query Editor. You put the password created, click on OK, and then the famous select start from employee, execute this query. We are running in the cloud, and we have the two employees. So in a few minutes, we using Prisma and Azure SQL and the new JS to scale our application. It took some time because we create the database server and shared, but after you create all this, and you see it's much faster. So here you have available some homework, important resources and link, documentation, official documentation of Azure SQL, how you can use this documentation. And within Microsoft Learn, which is an online courses platform, we have a specific course for Azure SQL. So I recommend you to have a look, and also documentation and official blog for Prisma. And if you want to learn more what was developed with the complete CRUDs that we have, you have the repository to have a look. And if you want to send an issue or something, or even to check the online application, you can do this. In addition, we have a free course for Azure SQL for beginners created by the products team of Azure SQL. We have Anna Hoffman and Dalvi Mauri, and it's a series with more than 61 short videos with the purpose of helping those people who have no knowledge about Azure SQL to get the necessary knowledge. And I will also make the link available. This is the link, free course Azure SQL in Bitbullseye. I super recommend you, okay? I also like to leave my contacts. I'm in LinkedIn, Twitter, much more. I create some series in Node and TypeScript, and there is something new. I will record a series of videos on how to create a full stack application, including several tools, and how you can deploy this application for both front end and back end with all these services, container, doc. But wait, okay, this will be soon, okay? So if you want to know the news about this series that will be in May, you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And I thank you for your participation, and I hope to see you in the next presentation or any in-person event. Bye-bye.